My brother called me 3 weeks before his wedding to tell me I wasn't invited. 110 guests, not one of them me. When I asked why, I heard the smile before he spoke. Then he said, "I can't let you come in there and be you, Maggie." I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I hung up and sat in my kitchen with the phone face down on the table and the soup going cold on the stove. 3 weeks later, I found a photograph on my phone. I sent it to his fiancée. She had no idea I existed. He had made very sure of that. My name is Maggie Collins. And this is what happened when the woman my brother spent 2 years erasing decided to introduce herself. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It helps the channel grow and reach more people. The invitation never came. That is where I want to start, because I think it is more honest than starting with the phone call. The phone call was the confirmation. The silence before it was the truth. Daniel got engaged in April. He texted me a photo of the ring, just the ring on Veronica's hand, slightly out of frame, a message that said, "She said yes," and a champagne glass emoji. I texted back a heart and congratulations. "Daniel, she's wonderful," and I meant both. I went to the pharmacy the same week and bought a card, a nice one, ivory with a simple design, and I left it on my kitchen counter because I wanted to write something real in it, not just the words that fill space. I thought, I'll write it when the invitation comes, include it with the gift, make it one good moment instead of two scattered ones. The card sat on my counter until October. Through May and June and July, I checked the mailbox the way you check a mailbox when you're expecting something, with a small, involuntary hope every time. I have a mailbox at the bottom of the stairs in my building, narrow, black paint slightly worn at the edges, a key that sticks a little in summer. Every day for months, bills, a pharmacy circular, a birthday card from my dentist with a coupon for whitening. Nothing with my name in formal script. Nothing ivory. I told myself things. That weddings take longer to organize than people expect. That Veronica's family was probably handling the invitations, and those things had their own timeline. That Daniel was busy. That they were both busy. That the invitation was coming. In August, my friend Elena asked me directly, over white bean soup at her kitchen table, whether I'd gotten my invitation yet. Elena has known me for 20 years. She asks direct questions the way a surgeon makes an incision, with precision, not cruelty. I said the mail had been slow. She looked at her bowl. She didn't push. Elena knows when I'm not ready to see something. She has always known. That is one of the 1,000 reasons I have kept her in my life. I was not ready. Before the phone call, before any of what happened after it, you need to understand who Daniel is to me, not who he became. Not the version of himself he had been building for 2 years inside the Ashmore world. Who he was, and who we were to each other, because without that, the rest of it makes no sense. We grew up on Ferris Street, 3rd floor of a brick building that smelled perpetually of the hallway and other people's cooking. Our father drove long-haul trucks for a regional carrier. Our mother, Rita, careful, quiet, with an eye for small things, cleaned other people's houses 3 days a week and spent the remaining days making our apartment feel like somewhere. She ironed the tablecloth on Sundays even though we had nowhere to go that required an ironed tablecloth. She kept a plant on the windowsill that she'd had since before I was born, and she talked to it in the mornings while she made coffee. Not in a mystical way, just in the way that people speak to living things that have been with them a long time. She had a way of making the small things count. We didn't have money. We had her attention, which in certain ways is rarer. Daniel arrived when I was 8. That is old enough to have a clear before and after, a life that was one shape, and then a new person arrived and the shape changed entirely. He was small and loud and extremely sure of himself for someone who couldn't yet walk with confidence, and within 6 months of his arrival, he had decided I was his favorite person in the world. He followed me everywhere. He cried when I left for school. He developed by age 4 a very specific look, dark eyes wide, my name said in a particular tone, that got him almost anything he wanted from me. and he used it with the unself-conscious precision of someone who doesn't yet understand they're doing it. I'm not complaining about this. I'm telling you who he was, because it matters. He was also genuinely smart, in the way that shows up in life rather than on tests. He struggled in school through most of middle school, didn't test well, got frustrated easily, was the kind of kid teachers described as not working to his potential in a tone that suggested they'd given up on potential entirely. But he noticed things. He read people with an accuracy that was unusual for someone his age. He understood by the time he was 12 that how you presented yourself was not deception, it was a skill, and he watched our father, who had no education past high school, but who could negotiate a contract change or talk his way out of a loading delay with more ease than most people manage anything. And he paid attention. He paid attention to everything. When I was 19 and he was 11, some boys at school had decided he was available for the particular harassment that gets directed at kids who come from the third floor of a building on Ferris Street and are small for their age. He didn't tell our parents. He told me. I don't know why he told me instead of them. Maybe because I was closer in age. Maybe because he'd already intuited that I would do something instead of worry. I went to the school the next morning. I was 19, still in my diner uniform because I'd come straight from an early shift, wearing sneakers and a jacket I'd had since sophomore year, and I sat across from the assistant principal, and I explained the situation clearly and specifically, and I did not leave until I had what I came for. A meeting arranged with the parents of the boys involved, and a written note in Daniel's file documenting the pattern. On the walk back to the building, he was quiet for a block, and then he said, "You didn't yell." I said, "Yelling is for when you don't have anything useful to say." He thought about that. He filed it. He brought it up 15 years later, at a diner somewhere, over eggs neither of us was that interested in, and he said, "I always thought about that, the way you walked in there like it was already settled." And I'd laughed and told him the assistant principal had been more scared of me than the boys had been of each other, and he'd laughed too. And it was one of those ordinary moments that you do not think to preserve because you assume there will be more of them. What I want you to understand about those years is that the care went both ways. This is important because what happened later could make it seem like I gave everything and received nothing, and that isn't true. Daniel called me when things went wrong. When he had a fever at 23 and felt too sick to drive himself to urgent care, he called me. When a girl he'd been seeing for 8 months ended it abruptly, and he sat in his car for an hour not wanting to go home to an empty apartment, he called me. When our father had a health scare 4 years ago, nothing serious, but frightening for the day it took to confirm that, Daniel called me first and I called him back, and we stayed on the phone for 40 minutes saying very little of consequence, just staying on the phone, which was the thing that was needed. He called me first. For years and years. That was the shape of us. I finished my administrative certificate at 22, 2 years of community college that I paid for myself by working nights and weekends at a diner on Route 9, where the Friday night college crowd undertipped and the regulars were kind, and I wore the same 3 pairs of work shoes in rotation because replacement was a budgeting event. I went straight into office work. Dental clinics, it turned out, have a particular kind of administrative chaos, scheduling and insurance and patient management, and the occasional small crisis that requires staying calm while someone is distressed, and I was good at it. I have been at the same practice for 8 years. Dr. Ramirez gave me a card on my 5th anniversary that said this place would fall apart without you, and I keep it in my top desk drawer. Some days it is useful to read. When Daniel graduated high school, our father's back had deteriorated enough that he'd moved to lighter work at lighter pay, and the financial gap between what Daniel needed and what existed was real. He had applied to colleges anyway, had gotten his grades up junior year, had a genuine letter of recommendation from his economics teacher, had the particular energy of someone who has decided something and is following through, and there were schools that wanted him, but the money wasn't there to close the distance. I sat with him at the kitchen table. I told him what I could do. I could cover 2 years at Lakeside Community College the way I'd covered my own 2 years. We could look at transfer options from there. It wasn't the plan he'd imagined. He'd imagined a 4-year school, a campus, the whole shape of it, and he was quiet for a moment when I said it. Not ungrateful, just absorbing the difference between what he'd pictured and what was possible. Then he nodded and said, "I'll pay you back." I said, "Finish school first." I paid his tuition every semester for 2 years. When he was 22 and the credit history wasn't there yet for a car loan, I co-signed. When he decided at 24 that he wanted his real estate license, had a mentor lined up, had done the research, had that particular focus in his voice that meant he had already committed, and came up $200 short on the course fee, I transferred it the same afternoon. He paid me back for the specific things. Not always on time, not always without a nudge, but he tried, and trying counted with me because I could see the effort underneath it, and he kept calling me first. That's what I keep returning to, even now. The first call. The first call when the Ashmore Property Group offer came in, and he couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. The first call when Veronica said yes to the ring. Me, before anyone else. Whatever version of himself he was building, I was still the first call. Until I wasn't. By the time he'd been at Ashmore Property Group for 2 years, things had shifted in a way I noticed but didn't examine. He stopped mentioning Ferris Street in conversation. He had a way of talking about himself now that moved in a kind of elegant loop. Ambition, hard work, result, ambition, that was not dishonest, exactly, but that left out a great deal. The specific past didn't appear. The trucking company, the tablecloth, my mother's 3 days a week in other people's houses. When I saw him, which was less often by then, and for shorter stretches, the version of Daniel who showed up in conversation was a version who had started from a general ordinary somewhere and worked his way up through talent and discipline alone. I noticed. I didn't say anything. It was not my version of himself to correct. What I didn't know, what I was still assembling, piece by piece, through the silence of those months, was how deep the editing had gone. I didn't know what he'd told Veronica's family, or what questions they'd asked that he'd answered with a particular careful smoothness. I only knew what I could see. A brother who was visiting less, calling less, and had gotten very good at steering conversations away from certain directions. The wedding was announced in April. The invitation never came. The call was on a Tuesday in September. I was making soup, white bean and kale, the recipe I make every fall. The smell of it in my apartment is one of the most consistent things I know. I saw Daniel's name on my phone, and I picked up the way I always had, without hesitation, because it was Daniel, and I always picked up for Daniel. He started vaguely. The wedding was going to be very intimate, very focused on Veronica's side of the family. A lot of her relatives were traveling from out of town, and the logistics were, he used the word curated. The whole thing was going to be very curated. He said this with the smooth care of someone managing a difficult conversation from the outside in. I let him talk. Then I said, "Daniel, am I invited to your wedding?" A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. I have known him for 30 years, and 2 seconds is enough. It's complicated, Maggie. How many people are coming? That's not the point, Daniel. How many people? A shorter pause. Around 110. I sat down at my kitchen table. I had not planned to sit down. My legs made the decision. 110 people, I said, and I'm not one of them. He exhaled, the exhale of someone who has been waiting, for weeks probably, to have a conversation he didn't know how to start and couldn't keep avoiding. He said something about Veronica's family and the way they operated and the specific world of the firm. He said there were impressions he'd been managing and that he needed this to go a certain way. He said, "You know how it is twice inside 30 seconds, which is what people say when they want you to do their explaining for them." I said, "Say it, Daniel. Tell me." There was a longer pause this time. And then I don't know if he meant for it to come out exactly as it did, or if it had simply been held long enough that it came out on its own weight. He said, "I can't let you come in there and be you, Maggie." That's the honest answer. I can't let you show up and be you. I didn't say anything. It's not that there's something wrong with you. It's the context. Veronica's family has a certain... He stopped, started again. You'd mention Ferris Street. You'd say something about Mom cleaning houses, about the diner, about how things actually were. And I've spent 2 years building something here. 2 years. I can't have one afternoon undo that. I said, "Be me. You can't let me be me. Maggie, that's what you said." He didn't deny it. He said something about context, about me not understanding what he'd built, about how I'd do it without even meaning to, how I'd just walk in being myself, and he'd spend the entire reception managing the fallout. He said he hoped I understood. He said it twice. I told him I had to go. I hung up. My soup was on the stove. I turned off the burner. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone face down in front of me, and I thought about very little for a while. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think getting it wrong would be dishonest, and this whole thing is only worth telling if I'm honest. I was not devastated. I had been expecting something, not this specific thing, but something in this direction, for long enough that when it arrived, it felt less like a wound and more like a door finally opened onto a room I'd been standing outside of for months. Things that hadn't fully made sense now made sense. The birthday dinner, where he'd steered every conversation away from our parents. The careful, neutral meeting spots. The 2 encounters with Veronica in 6 months of engagement. The way he never called on Sunday afternoons anymore. He hadn't been hiding me, not exactly. He'd been managing me, keeping me close enough that I'd never suspect, but contained enough that I'd never spill into his new life. And the thing about being managed, I realized sitting there, is that it doesn't feel like anything in particular while it's happening. It just feels like life being slightly off rhythm. It's only in retrospect that you see the shape of it. I sat at the table for a long time. I didn't tell Elena that night. I heated the soup the next day and ate it alone, and I thought about calling her and I didn't. I wasn't ready for someone else to have feelings about it while I was still working out my own. On Sunday I called my mother. We talk every Sunday, Rita and I, her knee, my week, the show she's been watching, how the plant on the windowsill is doing. It is one of the most reliable things in my life, that Sunday call. Somewhere near the end of it, she mentioned the wedding, said she was trying to figure out what to wear, that the venue required business formal, and she wasn't sure her good navy dress was right, that she was nervous about all of Daniel's. She lowered her voice slightly. Fancy new friends. She assumed I was going. She was talking to me as though we were both going. I said, "It sounds like a beautiful venue." I didn't tell her. I am going to be honest about why. Part of it was protection. My mother is 67 years old and in good health, and she loves Daniel, with the specific depth that mothers have for their younger children who struggled more, and I did not want to hand her a piece of information that would hurt her and that she would then spend weeks rearranging into a shape she could live with, a shape where Daniel made some sense. I knew what she would say, that he was under a lot of pressure, that the Ashmore family was a different world, that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But I also, and I am being honest, was holding it. The information. In those first days, I caught myself composing text messages to her that I never sent. "Mom, Daniel told me I can't come because being myself is the problem." I composed them and deleted them, and I knew, as I did, that there was something in the composing that wasn't pure. There was a part of me that wanted her to know what he'd done, wanted someone in the family to know, wanted the information to travel somewhere and do something. I deleted the drafts. That was the right call. But I'm not pretending I didn't write them. Elena came over on a Friday, 3 weeks after the call. She made the soup. She has the same recipe. We've made it together enough times that it's become a shared language between us, and I told her what had happened. She sat on the other end of the couch and listened without interrupting, which sounds simple and is not. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing, probably." She nodded once and let it be. What I didn't say out loud, what I was still working through in the slow hours of that period, was the part about Veronica. Not Daniel. Veronica. I had met her twice, and both times she had been genuinely present. The birthday dinner where she'd asked about my work and actually listened, and 3 months later in a parking lot where she'd mentioned, out of nowhere, 30 seconds of conversation, that she'd seen an article about dental anxiety and wondered if I'd read it. That's not a thing you do if you're performing attention. That's something you do if you paid attention and held on to it. She was going to marry someone she didn't fully know, someone who had given her a careful, edited version of himself. And the problem, as I kept turning it over, was not that he'd edited. People do that. Everyone presents themselves in certain ways at certain times, but that the editing had removed me. I wasn't a rough edge he'd smoothed. I was a person he'd made disappear, and the woman who was going to spend her life with him had no idea. That bothered me in a way I didn't have clean language for. It felt unjust is the word I kept coming back to. Not toward me, or not only, toward her. I had decided to do nothing. I lived inside that decision for about 2 weeks. It was not comfortable, but it was stable, which I have learned is sometimes enough. I went to work. I made coffee at home every morning with the same method I've used for years. Not because I think it tastes better, but because the routine of it is mine, and I have learned to value the things that are mine. I drove the same route. I ate soup and rearranged my closet and called my mother on Sundays and said nothing about any of it. There was one afternoon, about a week after Elena's visit, when I almost called Daniel back. I had his name up on my phone, and I sat with my thumb over it for probably 4 minutes. I'm not sure what I would have said. I think I wanted to ask him, in a calmer moment than the first call, whether some part of him understood what he'd done. Whether the word he'd used, "be you," had landed on him afterward the way it had landed on me, whether he'd lain awake with it. I didn't call. I put my phone down and washed the dishes that were in the sink, and by the time I was done, the impulse had passed. The problem, the one I kept circling back to, was still Veronica, not Daniel. I had arrived at a place where I could hold what Daniel had done without it consuming the whole day. What I couldn't arrive at was the part about her, a woman I'd met twice who had been kind to me in a particular, specific way that I respected, and who was walking into a marriage with a man whose history she didn't know. Not an edited version, a substituted one. That felt like something I didn't have the right to say nothing about, but I had decided to do nothing. Then I opened Instagram on a Thursday night and saw the photo. I don't use it much. I have an account that exists mostly so I can see Elena's hiking photos and what my cousin Dee in Portland is making for dinner. I was scrolling past a roasted squash recipe when the algorithm served me a photo of Veronica and Daniel at some rooftop bar, cocktail glasses in frame, city lights behind them, the kind of image that has been lightly adjusted to look like it hasn't been. Veronica looked genuinely happy. Daniel looked as though he had been born wearing that jacket. The caption read, "Can't wait to marry the most self-made man I know." Heart emoji. Self-made. I read it once. Then again, I put my phone face down on the couch cushion. Self-made. I thought about the diner on Route 9, my section on Friday nights, the undergrad crowd who left coins on the table, the way the soles of my feet felt at the end of a double shift, the transfer I made on the first of every month for 2 years into Daniel's account so he could attend Lakeside Community College and not have to work nights the way I had. I thought about the co-signed car loan and the $200 for the licensing course sent the same afternoon he asked. I thought about the morning of his first interview at his original agency, not Ashmore, the stepping stone place before Ashmore, when his car had been in the shop and he'd called me with a particular quality of quiet desperation in his voice, and I'd taken a half day from work and driven him and waited in the parking lot with a magazine for 90-25 minutes. And when he came back out across the parking lot, I watched his walk, and I knew before he reached the car that he'd gotten it. And when he opened the door, he was already grinning, and he said, "Mags," and that was enough. That was all he had to say. Self-made. I picked up my phone, I opened the camera roll and scrolled back 3 years. There it was. The sidewalk, the glass door building, his suit with the wrong shoulders, my blue blouse from the shift I'd left early. Both of us grinning the way you grin when something good finally happens and you're standing next to the right person. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened Instagram, found Veronica's account. She kept it public, and pressed the message icon. I typed, "Hi Veronica, I'm Maggie, Daniel's older sister. I don't think we've had a real chance to connect. Congratulations on the wedding. I'm so sorry I won't be there. I came across this photo recently and thought you might like it. It's from the day Daniel closed his first sale at his old agency, a few years back. He called me when it happened and I drove over. He worked so hard to get there. Wishing you both so much happiness. Maggie." I attached the photo. I pressed send. I set my phone face down on the coffee table, got up, and went to finish the closet reorganization I had been meaning to do since April. She responded the next morning at 7:43. "Maggie, oh my gosh. I didn't know. Daniel mentioned you but said you two weren't very close. This photo, his face. Can I ask, would you want to get coffee sometime before everything gets crazy with the wedding? I'd really love to meet you properly." I read it standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand. I wrote back, "I'd really like that." We met near her office on a Tuesday morning, 10 days before the wedding. She was there when I arrived, 5 minutes early, standing at the table rather than sitting, and she stood up when she saw me come through the door in the way people do when they're genuinely relieved that someone showed. She was nervous, not performed nervousness, the real kind, the kind that comes from asking for something you weren't certain you were entitled to ask for. We sat down. Her coffee was barely touched. She asked about growing up. She asked it carefully, the way careful people ask questions that might open something large. I answered honestly. I told her about Ferris Street, about the apartment and the way it smelled and my mother's tablecloth. I told her about my father's route schedules and the way our mother talked to the plant in the morning. I told her about Lakeside Community College, about the tuition transfers, about the morning of the first interview and the parking lot and the grin. I told these things the way you tell someone about your family when you love them, not to make a point, just because she'd asked and she was listening, and these were the true things. Veronica listened. She asked follow-up questions that told me she was actually processing rather than waiting for her turn to speak. She asked what Daniel had been like as a kid, and I told her about the school thing, about walking in to see the assistant principal, about the walk back after. She smiled at that, said, "That sounds exactly like something he would let someone do for him," then paused, like she was filing that observation somewhere. At one point she was quiet for a moment and then said, looking at her cup, "He told me you two weren't close, growing up, and now..." I looked at her. "We were very close," I said. She absorbed that. He told me the family was, ordinary was his word, that he'd come from a regular background and worked his way up, that there wasn't much family history to speak of. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to be honest without performing honesty. "Ordinary is one word," I said. "My mother ironed the tablecloth every Sunday. My father drove long haul until his back went. I worked nights at a diner to put myself through 2 years of college, and then I did it again for Daniel." I paused. That's the history. It exists whether or not it gets spoken about. She was quiet. Then, "He never mentioned any of this, any of it." "I know," I said. "Do you think he's..." She stopped. Reconsidered. "I'm not asking you to diagnose him. I'm just trying to understand whether this is something he knows he's done or something he's talked himself into not seeing." I thought about that for a moment. "I think," I said carefully, "that he's been building something for a long time, and that after a while the building becomes the whole story. And anything that doesn't fit the building just doesn't get brought along." She looked at the table. "And I fit the building," she said quietly. "You do," I said. "You're part of what he's building." She was quiet again, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd said too much. Then she looked up. "And you're what he left behind." "Yes," I said. "I think that's right." She looked at me for a long moment. She was not angry, not yet. That was not what was happening on her face. It was something more like recalibration. The quiet recognition of a person who has been given a picture and is now seeing that it is missing a very large part of the frame. She asked to see the photo again before we left. I handed her my phone. She zoomed in on Daniel's face, that grin, the suit that didn't fit right yet, and something moved across hers that I didn't have an exact name for. Not anger, not grief exactly. The particular expression of someone putting a thing down carefully because they need both hands for what comes next. She gave me back my phone. "Thank you for reaching out," she said. "Thank you for answering," I said. "We hugged the way you hug when you've talked about something real." Brief but not empty. I drove back to work and was 12 minutes late and told Dr. Ramirez I'd had an appointment, which was not entirely untrue. The wedding was on a Saturday in October. I spent it at Elena's. She made pasta and we watched 2 movies, and she didn't ask about Daniel once. That is one of the many reasons I will keep Elena in my life for as long as she'll have me, the knowing when not to ask. It is a skill that takes decades, and she has perfected it. I thought about Daniel a few times through the day, not with the sharp feeling I'd steeled myself for. With something quieter, the feeling you have when a chapter ends that you didn't write the conclusion to. A mild, unfinished thing, present but not consuming. I heard what happened at the rehearsal dinner from Veronica herself, about 10 days after the wedding. She called on a Sunday afternoon. We talked about ordinary things first. She asked about the clinic, told me about the restaurant they'd gone to the night before, mentioned a show she thought I might like. Then, without changing her tone particularly, she told me, during the rehearsal dinner, when the wine was open and the evening was warm and Daniel was at the head of the table, being the version of himself he was best at, charming, easy, every anecdote landing exactly where he placed it, Veronica had mentioned, casually, in the flow of conversation, that she'd had coffee with Maggie that week. Daniel's uncle Gerald, who had driven 9 hours from Ohio to attend, who had known our family since before Daniel was born, lit up the way people light up when they hear the name of someone they genuinely like. He said, "Maggie Collins? God, how is she? I haven't seen Maggie in ages." He turned to the table, to Richard Ashmore, to Veronica's mother, to the assembled guests, and said, "Daniel's older sister. She's something else. You know she put this one through school, worked nights to do it, never made a thing of it." He said it with pride. With uncomplicated, unstrategic pride, the way people speak about someone they admire when there's no reason not to. Veronica told me that Daniel's smile did not fall. She said it specifically, that way. His smile didn't fall. What it did was something smaller and more controlled. It recalibrated, adjusted by a precise fraction, the way a skilled person adjusts when a conversation shifts into territory they need to manage. And then he said something smooth. She couldn't remember the exact words, only the quality of the smoothness, and moved the table forward, and the dinner continued. But Richard Ashmore had been watching. Veronica said her father was a man who had built his company specifically by knowing when what he was being told did not match what he was seeing. He hadn't said anything at the dinner. He was not the kind of man who made scenes. But in the weeks after the wedding, in the normal course of a son-in-law at the office, presentations reviewed, deals followed up on, the ordinary daily texture of working alongside someone whose daughter you've just married, Richard Ashmore had begun asking Daniel different kinds of questions, more specific ones. The kind you ask when your earlier questions have started to feel insufficient. Veronica didn't tell me what he found, or what the questions were, or where it led. Maybe she didn't know yet. Maybe she did, and had decided it wasn't mine to carry. Either way, she didn't give me more than that, and I didn't ask for it. What she said, before we hung up, was, Gerald cried a little when he talked about you. He wasn't trying to make anything happen. He just said your name and what he knew about you, and he got a little emotional. He told me afterward he was sorry if he'd caused trouble. I told him he hadn't. I was quiet for a moment. Gerald was always kind, I said. He used to bring us oranges at Christmas. I don't know why I remember that. He just always brought a bag of oranges. Veronica laughed a little. I'll tell him. Daniel has not called. I'm not waiting. Veronica calls every few weeks, usually on Sunday afternoons. We talk about small things. A recipe. A show. Something she read. Something I noticed at the clinic. She asked me once about a dental issue, and I gave her Dr. Ramirez's number, which felt like the beginning of something ordinary, and I have come to understand that ordinary is not nothing. I still have the ivory card I bought in April, the nice one. I never wrote in it. It's in my kitchen drawer now, under some receipts and a takeout menu, and I find it sometimes when I'm looking for something else. I don't know what to do with it exactly. I haven't thrown it away. The photograph is still on my phone. I haven't moved it to a folder or organized it into anything. It's just there, in the camera roll, a few years back, the way things that matter tend to be, not filed away, just present. I look at it sometimes, his suit with the wrong shoulders, my blue work blouse, the gray November sky, both of us standing on that sidewalk grinning the way you grin when something finally happens and you're standing next to the person you wanted to tell first. He called me first that day. I drove over. That part didn't stop being true.